I came to my grandson's birthday with a gift in my hands. But before I could step inside the house, my daughter-in-law stopped me right at the door. She held up a tablet. On the screen was a grandson visitation agreement. Only Saturdays. And all gifts must be approved first. Visitation fee $1,200 per month. I was shocked, speechless. But I said nothing. 7 weeks later, I placed an envelope into my daughter-in-law's hand. When she read what was inside, she almost collapsed right there on her own doorstep. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you would do in this situation. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Note, this is a fictional story created for storytelling, but it still carries meaningful and helpful insights. The laminated sheet of paper didn't just slide across the granite countertop. It hissed a clinical sound that cut right through the muffled excitement of my grandson's 6th birthday. I stood there, Vance Kendrick, a 67-year-old retired bridge inspector, with eyes that still looked for cracks in foundations, feeling the heavy weight of an off-road RC truck in my arms. The box was massive, $120 of plastic, and gears meant to conquer the backyard dirt. But it felt like lead against my chest. Blocking the threshold was Leonie Morgan, a 38-year-old nonprofit director whose efficiency felt more like a weapon than a skill. She didn't offer a hug or even a smile. She simply held a clipboard like a shield, her eyes as cold as the morning frost on a Michigan highway. Behind her, 6-year-old Milo Kendrick pressed his palms against the storm door, his face lighting up at the sight of the gift, his muffled laughter vibrating through the glass. I tried to step forward, but Leonie's posture didn't budge. "Happy birthday, Milo," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look what Grandpa brought you." Leonie didn't look at the boy. "Wait, Vance," she said, her voice dropping into that rehearsed professional register she used for board meetings. "We need to get on the same page before you go any further." She wasn't just asking for a chat. She handed me a 3-page document titled Gift Approval and Family Support Agreement. This wasn't a sudden thought. It was a premeditated financial trap typed and laminated before I had even pulled into the driveway. My son, Lawson Kendrick, a 41-year-old high school vice principal, who looked far older than his years, stood in the kitchen hallway, staring at his shoes, a ghost in his own home. Have you ever looked at your own flesh and blood and realized you were being appraised like a piece of distressed real estate? I looked from the legal jargon to Lawson, but he refused to meet my eyes. Leonie explained with the detached grace of an auditor that due to Milo's extravagant developmental needs, any future visitation now required a recurring monthly contribution of $1,200. $1,000, I whispered, the indignation rising like a tide in my throat. "Leonie, I am his grandfather, not a subscription service." I turned my gaze toward the hallway. "Lawson, for God's sake, say something." He just shifted his weight, the smell of the birthday cake in the oven suddenly making me nauseous. The cold granite of the island felt like a tombstone under my hand as I read the clause that essentially barred me from the property without a cleared transaction. Milo was still there, watching through the French doors, his small hands still pressed against the wood eyes fixed on the bright decals of the truck. My heart broke for the boy, but my mind was sharpening, calculating the structural failure of this family. The door didn't just close. It clicked, a final metallic seal on a relationship I thought was made of gold. I backed away, refusing to press my pen to her extortion. "The truck stays in the car. Leonie," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I won't buy my way into my own family." As I reached the porch, Lawson finally spoke, his voice thin and hollow, repeating her script. "It is for Milo's future, Dad," he said, confirming he was fully under her thumb. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, realizing that $1,200 wasn't just a fee, it was the exact amount I'd seen missing from my late wife's legacy accounts just a month prior. Grief has a specific smell, a mixture of stale lilies and the cold metallic scent of a hospital room, and tonight, it was thick enough to choke me as I stared at the photo of Eloise holding our grandson. I sat in the center of the kitchen in Grand Rapids, the very heart of the home we had shared for 40 years. But the silence felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. The hum of the refrigerator was the only voice left in the house, a low and steady vibration that seemed to mock the emptiness of the chairs around the table. Just hours ago, I had been standing in a foyer in Holland, fighting for the right to see my own blood. But now I was just a man in a quiet room with a head full of sharp, jagged suspicions. I reached out and touched the glass of the frame, tracing the edge of my wife's smile. It was January 2021, the only time she got to hold Milo before the pancreatic cancer stole the breath from her lungs. "I wish you were here to tell me I am overreacting," I whispered into the shadows. "But you always said I had too much trust in foundations that hadn't been tested." My mind drifted back to a dinner we had shortly after Lawson and Leonie's wedding, a night filled with the kind of hope that blinded me to the cracks already forming in the masonry. I had presented them with an $85,000 check for a down payment on their house in Holland, viewing it as a bridge I was building for the next generation. I remember the way the dining room air felt thin and cold, and the way Leonie's eyes didn't settle on me or Lawson. Instead, they tracked that check with the sharp, clinical focus of a predator calculating its next meal. She hadn't even finished her dessert before she brought out a spreadsheet, already outlining how my engineering firm's value could be leveraged for what she called diversified investments. "Do you know what it feels like to realize that your wife's final moments of joy were being used as a backdrop for a bank transfer?" I remember Lawson nodding along, his eyes glazed with a mixture of exhaustion and a desire to please her, while I just sat there thinking it was all part of being a supportive family. I stood up the floorboards groaning under my feet and walked to my home office. I pulled out the heavy filing folders labeled Family Gifts, the drawer sliding open with a familiar metallic rasp. I found the carbon copy of that $85,000 transfer, the paper crinkling under my fingers like old leaves. As I compared the dates to the recent $1,200 access fee demand, a pattern began to emerge from the chaos of the numbers. Memory is a bridge with a lot of hidden rust. You don't see the structural failure until you're already falling through the gaps. I saw the withdrawals Leonie claimed were for emergency repairs, each one siphoning a little more of our legacy away. Then I saw it tucked in the margin of an old bank statement. It wasn't in Lawson's loose scrawl, but in Leonie's tight, controlled hand. She had listed my engineering firm's estimated liquidation value right next to the words, "Exit Strategy, Year 5. The date on that note wasn't just any day. It was tomorrow. And I finally understood why the $1,200 demand was delivered with such sudden, desperate urgency. I pulled the 3-ring binder from the bottom drawer, the plastic sleeve sticking to the wood, like a scab that didn't want to be ripped off. The smell of old desk wood and cedar was replaced by the crinkle of laminated plastic as I spread the various versions of Leonie's grandparent visitation guidelines across the flat surface of my own desk. I am a man who has spent my entire career looking for structural fatigue, and yet I had missed the deliberate erosion happening in my own family. I traced the progression of these pages with a trembling finger. In 2021, it was a single-page list of Milo's food allergies, a reasonable request from a new mother. By 2024, it had mutated into a comprehensive 4-page legalistic manifesto. Leonie's voice echoed in my mind, a soft, persuasive purr. It's just for Milo's routine, Vance. We need consistency, or he gets overwhelmed. I realized now that every rule was a brick in a wall introduced under the guise of structure, but functioning solely as a barrier for me. My gaze fell on the parking restriction section. I remembered a rainy Tuesday in the spring of 2024 when Leonie told me I could no longer park in the driveway. She claimed it stressed the neighbors and blocked the emergency egress. I can still feel the weight of a heavy box of books in my arms as I carried it 3 blocks in the pouring rain my coat soaked through. Just because I didn't want to break her rules and lose my precious 2-hour window with Milo. I had looked at the empty driveway as I walked past, then at Lawson, who was standing by the garage. "The street is fine, Dad," he had said, refusing to look me in the eye. "Leonie just wants to keep the driveway clear for the grocery delivery." "It's 3 blocks away," Lawson, I had replied, the rhythm of the rain against the window of my car later that night sounding like a funeral march. "Have you ever seen a cage being built around you, one polite request at a time, until the bars are too thick to bend?" I noticed something chilling as I read the emergency egress clause again. It was word for word a section from a standard assisted living facility contract. She wasn't just managing my visits. She was already rehearsing my institutionalization. I began to map these rules against my financial gifts, using the analytical coldness of a bridge inspector. Every time I provided a significant sum, whether for a new roof, a landscaping project, or a vacation fund, the visitation rules became more restrictive immediately afterward. The money wasn't buying me love or access. It was buying my displacement. The ink was fresh. The intent was ancient. I wasn't a grandfather anymore. I was a line item in a budget. I reached the very back of the binder and found a loose sheet of paper. It was a move-in checklist dated for the upcoming week. My home address was at the top, but it was listed under a category called liquidated asset. I realized the exit strategy wasn't just about my house. It was about my heartbeat. The Starbucks meeting Lawson had scheduled for tomorrow wasn't a request for a chat between father and son. It was a summons to my own funeral, and the realization turned the air in my office to ice. I watched my son through the coffee shop window, his hands trembling so violently he had to set his latte down, and I knew I wasn't walking into a reconciliation, I was walking into an ambush. The exit strategy I had discovered in my study was no longer a theoretical fear. It was the summons to my own funeral that I had anticipated since the night before. I pulled into the Hudsonville Starbucks, my eyes scanning the parking lot with the same diagnostic scrutiny I used for cracked trusses and shifting abutments. There were too many polished SUVs and not enough soul in this town anymore. I stepped inside, the hiss of the espresso machine sounding like steam escaping a failing boiler. I chose a seat that put my back to the wall, a tactical habit from 30 years of inspecting unstable structures. Lawson Kendrick looked physically diminished, as if the air in the room was being sucked out by the woman waiting for him back in Holland. He pushed a stale blueberry muffin toward me like a peace offering, but the gesture was as hollow as his gaze. "You look tired, Lawson," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "Is Leonie keeping you up with more guidelines?" He flinched, his eyes darting toward the door, as if she might materialize from the steam. "Dad, don't," he whispered. "We're just worried about you being alone in that big house." The air between us was thick with the artificial scent of burnt beans and the very real stench of a son being used as a mouthpiece for his wife's greed. He opened a manila folder, the cold gloss of the brochure paper, catching the overhead LED light. It was for Lakeview Senior Living in Kalamazoo. My breath hitched when I saw the red header. These weren't for the independent living wings. They were for the high-security memory care unit. Have you ever sat across from the boy you taught to ride a bike and realized he was now holding the pen for your death warrant? Lawson began to drone on about $7,000 a month, describing a life of scheduled bingo and controlled medication, as if it were a luxury cruise rather than a prison cell. Leonie says the equity in the business is the key, he said, his voice cracking. You'd have professional management for your assets. I listened in icy silence, calculating the math. That's $84,000 a year, Lawson. My entire savings would be gone in 2 seasons. The true hook finally dropped. Leonie wanted me to sign over a durable power of attorney, immediately claiming it was a prerequisite for the application. She says you've been forgetting things, Dad, he said, the tremor in his voice betraying his guilt. She wants the firm Lawson. She wants the keys to the vault before the body is even cold. He wasn't my son anymore. He was a ventriloquist's dummy with Leonie's hand up his back. He slipped up, then mentioning that some man named David in Kalamazoo had already appraised my engineering equipment. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. David Price, the liquidator. They were already gutting the legacy while I was still standing. I looked my son dead in the eye, took the memory care brochure, and slowly tore it in half. The sound of the paper rending was the loudest thing in the shop. Right then, my phone buzzed on the table with an urgent notification from my accountant. I knew then that the reconstruction was over. It was time for the demolition. I didn't wait for Lawson to finish his coffee. I was out the door before the torn pieces of the memory care brochure even hit the floor. My phone vibrating in my palm with a warning that I was no longer just a grandfather, I was a target. I sat in my car, the engine idling with a low mechanical growl that matched the vibration in my chest. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to a frantic voicemail from Sandra Redmond. She explained that a $12,000 transfer had been attempted from my late wife's legacy account just an hour ago. The electronic signature they used was a forged version of my own, a crude imitation of the hand that had signed off on the safety of thousands of commuters. I realized then that the $1,200 access fee Leonie had demanded was just a smokescreen, a petty distraction designed to keep me looking at the surface while she went for the deep supports. Silas discovers that the David in Kalamazoo Lawson mentioned is actually David Price, a notorious high-risk liquidator who specializes in distressed sales for families in legal disputes. This wasn't a family disagreement. It was a professional liquidation. I drove directly to downtown Grand Rapids, the familiar hum of the city traffic sounding like white noise against the cold, professional fury building in my gut. I walked into the office of Silas Thornton, a 55-year-old family law attorney who spoke in perfectly formed sentences and looked at the world through a lens of absolute objectivity. He studied the laminated list of rules I placed on his desk, his expression unchanging as he pulled up recent filings in the county court. He was checking for any notice of incapacity Leonie might have filed to strip me of my legal standing before I could fight back. "She's moving faster than I anticipated, Vance," he said, the ticking of the grandfather clock in his office punctuating the gravity of his words. "She's not just isolating you. She's trying to civilly execute you. Have you ever seen the blueprints for your own destruction and realized the architect was someone you once shared Christmas dinner with? It is a sickening feeling, like watching a bridge collapse in slow motion while you are standing on the center span." Silas leaned back, the smell of expensive leather and old law books wrapping around us like a shield. He laid out the protocol. For 7 weeks, I had to play the part of the confused, compliant senior. I was to attend every visit park exactly where she demanded and sign absolutely nothing. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was a siege. Every restriction and every petty rule had to be documented in a hidden log to build the case for unreasonable denial under the state's Grandparenting Act. If she thinks she's winning, she'll get sloppy with the paper trail, Silas warned. 7 weeks, I replied, my voice steady. I can do 7 weeks for Milo. As I stood to leave, Silas revealed one final piece of intelligence. Leonie had already attempted to update the beneficiary on my primary life insurance policy to a trust she controlled, claiming administrative convenience. He handed me a specialized recording device disguised as a silver keychain, the metal feeling cold and heavy in my hand. The first visit of the protocol started tomorrow, but Silas told me there was one thing I needed to do before I stepped back into that house. I watched the laser printer hum to life, spitting out warm pages of bank statements that looked like ordinary household math, but each line was actually a signature on a slow-motion robbery. The silver keychain Silas had given me sat heavy in my pocket, a silent reminder that my life had become an undercover operation. I walked into the quiet Grand Rapids office of Sandra Obi, a meticulous 50-year-old accountant who kept records like a librarian and tracked money like a bloodhound. She sat surrounded by the paper trail of my life, her desk a battlefield of spreadsheets and ink. Sandra treats a ledger like a crime scene, and the smell of ozone and fresh ink in the room made the analytical horror of the situation even more acute. She had cross-referenced the $85,000 down payment gift I had given Lawson and Leonie with their joint account records, mapping the flow of capital with terrifying precision. It is not just the money, Vance, she said, her voice steady as the ticking wall clock behind her. It is the timing. She pointed to a recurring pattern of transfers that had initiated shortly after Eloise passed away. Small amounts, $50 here, $200 there, but they were relentless. Every time I gave them a little extra for what Leonie called home repairs or Milo's school supplies, she was siphoning the equivalent out the back door. Have you ever found out that the person you trusted with your family's future was actually auctioning it off piece by piece? Sandra explained the mechanics of the fraud, showing me how the funds were moved into an account registered under a shell LLC Leonie founded years ago. She calls it strategic management in the filings, Sandra noted, but I call it embezzlement. The account showed no legitimate business activity, only a series of withdrawals for high-end retail spa days and unexplained stays in Kalamazoo. I realized then that I wasn't just funding a home for my son. I was funding a lifestyle for a predator. The most chilling discovery came when Sandra looked at the digital signatures. Leonie had been forging Lawson's electronic signature for these transfers for over a year. My son wasn't just a bystander. He was a victim of identity theft by his own wife. The printer gave a final rhythmic click as Sandra hit the total. $32,000 had been drained over the last 14 months alone. $32,000. I whispered, the cold clarity of the number cutting through me. That is more than Milo's entire future college fund. The paper felt heavy in my hand, a $32,000 weight that finally gave me the leverage I needed to push back. Sandra handed me the forensic report, advising me to take it directly to Silas. This was the structural flaw we needed to find. I looked at the mailing address for the Shell LLC and saw it was a P.O. box in Kalamazoo, directly linked to David Price, the liquidator Silas had warned me about. The exit strategy was no longer a theory. It was a coordinated strike. I tucked the report into my jacket, the crisp texture of the pages a shield against the cold wind of Grand Rapids as I stepped out. But as I walked to my car, I saw a familiar black SUV parked across the street, Leonie's car, and for a second, I thought the undercover game had ended before it even started. The black paint of Leonie's SUV didn't just reflect the afternoon sun. It seemed to absorb it. A dark hole in the middle of a Grand Rapids street that signaled my cover was blown before the first move was even made. I stood paralyzed by my car door, the forensic report Sandra had just handed me tucked tightly inside my jacket. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that made the glare of the sun on the black car paint feel like a physical interrogation. I watched the SUV through my sunglasses, my thumb hovering over the metallic click of my own car door. For a full, agonizing minute, I waited for the driver's side to open for Leonie to step out and demand to know why I was meeting with a forensic accountant. Then a stranger I had never seen before climbed into the driver's seat. It was the same make and model, the same deep tint on the windows, but it wasn't her. The adrenaline spike left me lightheaded. "Get it together, Vance." I whispered to myself, the cold hum of the city fading back into the background. I realized then that I was seeing ghosts because she had already haunted every corner of my life. I drove back to the law office, my hands finally steadying on the wheel. I returned to Silas Thornton's quiet sanctuary, the smell of old paper and the rough texture of the bridge journal I carried, providing a grounding contrast to the paranoia outside. I presented the $32,000 theft evidence, spreading the forensic report next to the legal documents Silas had prepared. He revealed that while that specific SUV was a shadow, Leonie actually had hired a private investigator to follow me. They just hadn't spotted our meetings yet. We finalized the 7-week protocol right then. It was a strategic blueprint that required me to act as the perfect compliant target. "If she thinks you're broken, she'll stop hiding the transfers," Silas said, his voice as cool as the law office air conditioning. Greed is always louder than caution. Can you imagine the discipline it takes to let someone treat you like a failing machine when you're actually the one dismantling their engine? I agreed without hesitation. 7 weeks of playing the victim to save my grandson's future was a price I was more than willing to pay. Silas explained the stakes with a heavy finality. One mistake, one flash of my controlled anger, and she could use it to justify a restraining order or that memory care commitment Lawson had mentioned. I received a specialized logbook, disguised as a common bridge inspection journal, to record every minute of the upcoming visits. I wasn't just a grandfather anymore. I was an operative in the survival of the Kendrick name. The clock started now. 50 days. 120 hours. One chance. Silas leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Starting tomorrow, you are the world's most agreeable man. You park where she says, you eat what she approves." I looked at the rough texture of the journal in my hands and nodded. "I've inspected bridges with deeper cracks than her marriage," I told him. "I know how to hold steady." Silas then handed me a secret emergency contact card for a forensic IT specialist. The plan was expanding. We weren't just watching her, we were preparing for a digital sweep of the Holland house. I walked to my car with the bridge journal tucked under my arm, unaware that the first week 1 visit would start with a change to the rules that Leonie hadn't even bothered to laminate yet. I parked exactly 2 blocks away, my digital watch synced to the second. Knowing that in Leonie's world, arriving at 1:01 p.m. was a scheduled offense, and arriving at 12:59 p.m. was an act of aggression. I sat in the idling car for a moment, the bridge journal tucked under my arm. It wasn't just a prop, it was my shield. I walked the 3 blocks to the manicured house in Holland, my gait steady, hiding the prickling paranoia that told me a private investigator was somewhere in the suburban quiet, documenting my every step. The front door opened before I could reach for the bell, Leonie standing there like a warden. I stepped into the living room, and my eyes, trained to find the smallest structural anomalies, immediately caught the glint of a new, unblinking lens nestled in the crown molding. Leonie didn't mention the camera, but she stood directly beneath it, her posture stiff as she recited the safety briefing for the day's 2-hour window. "You're precisely on time, Vance," she said, her voice clinical and devoid of warmth. "Let's keep the interactions in the common area today." I nodded vaguely, adopting the slightly vacant expression of a man whose mind was supposed to be fraying at the edges. "Of course, Leonie." "Whatever makes the house run smoother," I replied. The smell of industrial floor cleaner was so strong, it masked any hint of a home, making the living room feel more like a waiting room. I sat on the edge of the sectional, the fabric rough against my palms, helping Milo with his solar system project. We worked with styrofoam spheres, the grainy texture of the planets, shedding white dust onto the carpet. Every time our heads leaned together to glue a ring around Saturn, I felt Leonie's presence shift. She moved through the kitchen, maintaining a direct line of sight through the open floor plan. A lens is a tiny thing, but when it's pointed at your soul, it feels like a cannon. During a brief moment when a delivery driver rang the front bell, Leonie vanished toward the foyer. Milo leaned in close, his voice a frantic whisper. "Grandpa, why does Mom say you have the forgetting sickness?" He looked at me with a fear that shattered my heart. "Are you going to go away like the birds in winter?" My blood ran cold with a fury I had to bury deep. Leonie was gaslighting a 6-year-old, using his love as a weapon to justify the bars she was building around me. I squeezed his hand gently. "I'm right here, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." The chime of the kitchen timer ended our world exactly at the 2-hour mark. Leonie was there instantly, her eyes conducting an exit audit of my pockets, silently accusing me of theft. "We'll see you next Saturday." Vance provided the routine stays stable. She set her tone a final dismissal. "I'll be here." "Exactly at 1, I promised." How do you explain to a child that his mother is using his love as a weapon against his own blood? I walked back to my car, the cold Holland wind biting at my face, the weight of the silver keychain recorder in my pocket feeling like a live wire. I clicked the unlock button on my car, but when I looked in the side mirror, I saw Leonie standing on the porch, not watching me leave, but taking a photo of my license plate as if I were a trespasser in my own son's life. I didn't even have my foot through the door before Leonie's hand was out palm up, demanding my smartphone like a TSA agent suspecting a threat. I had spent the week in my Grand Rapids study replaying the recordings of her clinical voice, planning every step of this second week with the precision of a structural load test. I knew the rules were shifting. Leonie claimed that for Milo's online safety, she now had to audit all mobile devices entering the home to ensure no unauthorized photos were being taken or transmitted. "It's just a precaution, Vance," she said, her long nails tapping impatiently against the kitchen island. "We can't have images of Milo's location floating on the cloud." I maintained my persona of a slightly tech-confused senior, offering her a shaky, compliant smile as I handed over the device. "I barely know how to send a text, Leonie," I told her, "but if it makes you feel safe, take it." I had spent hours scrubbing that phone of every legal contact and message, but Silas had installed a hidden cloning app first. Every time her fingers swiped across the cold glass of the screen, I wasn't just losing my privacy. I was actually tracking her digital footprint and capturing her own location data. She sat at the counter, the smell of industrial floor cleaner still lingering in the foyer, and began a meticulous scroll through my life. While Milo played with stale plastic blocks in the living room, Leonie's eyes hunted for keywords. I watched her from the corner of my eye, noticing the fever pitch of her suspicion. She was looking for law firms or accountants. Her exit strategy deadline looming like a structural failure she couldn't quite see yet. "Who is this S? Thornton in your recent calls, Vance?" she asked, her voice sharp. I didn't flinch. "That's my old bridge structural consultant," I lied smoothly. "He's helping me with a foundation issue at my place." Have you ever sat perfectly still while someone erased your memories right in front of you just to see if you'd flinch? Leonie's thumb hovered over a file, and with a sudden casual flick, she deleted the only remaining video I had of Eloise's last birthday. It was an act of petty malice disguised as a technical error, a calculated attempt to see if I was still sharp enough to mourn the loss. The screen went black. The video was gone, but my resolve. That was just getting started. I felt the adrenaline-fueled deception coursing through me, but I kept my hands steady on my knees. When she finally returned the phone with a tight, unsatisfied smile, the rest of the visit proceeded under a heavy, oppressive silence. I finished my 2 hours and retreated to the street, the cold wind hitting my face as I reached the safety of my car. I pulled out my bridge inspection journal, and the scratch of my pen against paper felt like a small victory. I recorded the exact time and nature of the phone seizure, documenting the violation for the case Silas was building. As I looked at the logbook, I realized the GPS data Leonie's audit had left behind showed her car wasn't in Kalamazoo. For a girls' weekend last Friday, it was parked at a motel 3 blocks from my engineering firm. I felt a cold shock of icy determination. She wasn't just planning an exit. She was already circling the perimeter of my life's work. I ignored the black SUV and the feeling of eyes on my neck, focusing instead on the small wooden box in my lap, a bridge between the son I was losing and the grandson I was determined to save. I sat in my car for a moment on the familiar street in Holland, Michigan, the silence of the neighborhood weighing heavy. The GPS data from my phone audit earlier in the week had confirmed my darkest suspicions. Leonie wasn't just siphoning money. She was scouting the perimeter of my business, preparing for a final liquidation. I knew I had to move with clinical precision. I stepped out of the car, clutching 2 vintage model airplane kits. They weren't gifts. Gifts required the scrutiny of Leonie's laminated rulebooks. No, today, these were educational structural models for a science project, a tactical loophole I hoped she wouldn't close. When I entered the foyer, the air felt sterile, as if the life was being systematically scrubbed from the hallway. I noticed Lawson immediately. He was wearing long sleeves despite the thermostat being set to 72. As he reached to take my coat, the fabric pulled back, revealing a wrist so thin it made my stomach turn. He had lost significant weight since the birthday incident, his face gaunt and his eyes shadowed with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. Leonie appeared at the dining room archway, her clinical voice cutting through the space. "I hope those meet our safety standards, Vance," she said. "It is just a lesson in aerodynamics." "Leonie," I replied, keeping my voice as flat and non-threatening as a blueprint. Perfectly safe for a 6-year-old. She inspected the kits with the cold eye of a customs agent. "I suppose, if it stays on the table and the glue is non-toxic." We sat at the table, the rattling of plastic parts in the box the only sound in the room. While Milo excitedly sorted the struts and propellers, I leaned in. "Remember the smell of that old shop in the garage, Lawson?" I asked. "The summer of '94 when we built the P-51. I brought up the scent of balsa wood and plastic cement, the way the heat of the Grand Rapids sun used to make the sawdust dance in the air. A man's voice is the first thing he loses when his home becomes a prison." For a second, Lawson's scripted posture cracked. I I haven't thought about that in a long time, Dad, he whispered. His eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment I saw the son I knew before the guidelines and the audits. But the moment was severed when Leonie approached. Milo has a sensory sensitivity to the sound of plastic snapping today, she announced, reaching for the kits. It is getting a bit loud, don't you think, Lawson? His hands didn't just shake, they pleaded. He reached out to help her pack the kits away, his fingers trembling violently against the table. Yes, maybe we should put it away for now, he stammered, his spirit looking as fragile as the thin plastic wings Milo had just unboxed. It was an alarming realization. My son was in a state of constant fight or flight, a victim of the same isolation she was perfecting on me. As I stood to leave, Lawson brushed past me in the foyer. I felt a sharp, rough texture against my hand, a crumpled note. He slipped it into my pocket with a desperate, silent look. I felt the crinkle of the paper in my pocket as I walked to my car, realizing Lawson had just handed me the final evidence of Leonie's exit strategy year 5, and it was uglier than I ever imagined. The ink on the house sale agreement was barely dry, but the signature at the bottom was a jagged scar that told me Leonie wasn't just planning my move, she was already spending the equity. I sat in the dark safety of my car, the interior smelling of old leather and the lingering scent of the model airplane kit I had just shared with Lawson. My hands shook as I smoothed out the crumpled copy he had slipped me. It wasn't just a pre-listing agreement for my Grand Rapids home. It was a comprehensive liquidation plan. Leonie was listed as the primary contact and the authorized signatory under a pending power of attorney she expected me to sign any day now. But the rot went deeper. As I scanned the fine print, I realized she had also listed Lawson's Holland house for sale. She was selling my life while I was still living in it, and she was gutting my son's future right alongside mine. I needed more than just bank statements now. I needed physical proof of her intent to bring to Silas Thornton. I stepped back into the house for the week 4 visit, finding the foyer unusually quiet. Milo was at a playdate down the street, and Lawson was making a tactical retreat into the garage. This was the opening I needed. I drifted into the kitchen, my footsteps silent on the hardwood. Leonie was in the laundry room, the smell of expensive detergent wafting through the air as she conducted a muffled, high-stakes conference call. "No, the Kalamazoo closing has to happen before the new year," she snapped, the vibration of her voice carrying through the wall. "We need the liquid capital." I looked at the granite island, where the sharp light reflected off a stack of mail and brochures. A kitchen counter is for making sandwiches, not for mapping out the end of a man's freedom. I flipped through the glossy pages, Golden Years, Living, and Kalamazoo Memory Suites. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw a neon yellow sticky note in Leonie's tight, aggressive handwriting. It read, "Vance, Room 402 Intake, December 15th. Intake December 15th. That was exactly 3 weeks away. Have you ever seen your own name on a move-in list for a place that doesn't let you keep the keys to your own life? It was a cold, mortal alarm. I pulled my phone out my hand, steady with the cold rage of a man who had finally found the structural flaw. I snapped high-resolution photos of the brochures, the sticky note, and a Kalamazoo Luxury Suites hotel reservation confirmation tucked inside. The hotel dates matched the exact weekends Leonie had claimed to be at leadership seminars. She wasn't just liquidating my assets. She was using my stolen money to fund a secret life in Kalamazoo. I heard the laundry room door creak open, the rhythmic clicking of Leonie's heels signaling her return to the kitchen. But as I pulled my hand back, I saw one more thing on the counter that made my heart stop. It was my own checkbook, the one I kept in my desk at home. It was open to the register showing 3 large stubs missing from the very back. She had been in my house. She had taken the tools of my financial identity while I was miles away, and the ink on those missing stubs was surely destined for David Price. I slid back into the living room sectional with the grace of a ghost. The bridge journal opened to a random page of structural notes just as Leonie's shadow fell across the carpet. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, a sharp, mechanical rhythm that I had to force into a steady cadence before she rounded the corner. I had seen my own checkbook on her counter, stripped of 3 large stubs, and the realization that she had been inside my private home while I was away felt like a physical violation of my perimeter. I kept my eyes fixed on a diagram of a suspension cable, the scratch of my pen on the paper, providing a thin veil of normalcy. Leonie entered the room, the clinical silence of the living room, magnifying the rhythmic clicking of her heels. She paused, her eyes scanning the furniture for any sign that her carefully curated environment had been disturbed. "You've been very quiet today, Vance," she said, her voice dropping into that rehearsed pitch of concern she used when she was fishing for a weakness. "Is everything all right?" I looked up slowly, adopting the slightly vacant expression of a man whose mind was supposed to be fraying at the edges. "Just looking at some old load-bearing specs, Leonie," I replied, my voice thin and steady. "My mind isn't as sharp as it used to be, you know." I saw the flash of satisfaction in her eyes, the look of a predator watching a support beam finally give way. She sat in the armchair opposite me, watching me with a cold, analytical intensity that I knew was intended to document my supposed decline. The tension was broken by the front door swinging open as Milo returned from his playdate. He was bursting with a frantic, uncharacteristic excitement, clutching a high-end professional-grade tablet that glowed with a brilliant blue light. "Look, Grandpa, it has a pen and everything," he shouted, holding the cold glass of the screen toward my face. I examined the device, identifying the model as a top-of-the-line unit, costing at least $600. Leonie quickly interjected, claiming she had found it at a liquidation outlet for a steal. "Have you ever seen a bribe disguised as a toy and realized you were the one who signed the check for your own replacement?" I noticed a retail sticker on the back from a boutique electronics store in Kalamazoo, a direct contradiction to her lie. More importantly, when I helped Milo set it up, I saw the device profile was registered to her secret LLC Strategic Management. She was buying his loyalty with my stolen funds and likely writing it off as a business asset. Later that evening, back in the safety of my Grand Rapids home, I sent the photos of the stolen check stubs and the tablet model to Sandra Obi. The ping of the text message notification was the sound of a trap closing. Sandra confirmed within minutes that a $650 withdrawal had been made from the joint account I had recently replenished for Milo's future. $650. One tablet. One more nail in the coffin of her credibility. The tablet's history even contained a digital receipt for a Kalamazoo dinner for 2 on a night Leonie claimed to be at a leadership seminar. I realized then that week 6 wasn't just another visit. It was the final assembly of the evidence, and Silas Thornton had already cleared his schedule for the point of no return. I didn't knock on Silas's door. I simply walked in and laid the bridge journal on his mahogany desk, like a soldier returning from the front lines with a map of the enemy's camp. The weight of the evidence I had gathered over the last 6 weeks felt like a physical burden, but as I sat down in the plush leather chair, I felt the first stirrings of a cold, tactical peace. Silas Thornton looked up, his sharp eyes scanning my face before settling on the journal. Sandra Obi sat in the corner, her lap occupied by a thick audit binder that she placed on the table with a heavy thud. We had reached the point of no return. Silas revealed that he had already pre-notified the bank to freeze my legacy accounts, effectively cutting off Leonie's Year 5 exit funding 48 hours before her scheduled intake date for my institutionalization. The trap was set. We spent the next hour in a war council compiling the 3 primary pillars of our counteroffensive, the forensic audit of the $32,000 theft, the documented pattern of my grandparental isolation, and the physical evidence of the memory care scheme I'd photographed on her kitchen counter. Silas reviewed the Michigan Grandparenting Time Act one last time, ensuring my legal standing was airtight. "We have enough for a criminal referral, Vance," he said, his voice echoing in the room. "Misappropriation of funds and elder abuse in the 2nd degree." I shook my head, my jaw tight. "I don't want a jail cell for the mother of my grandson, Silas. I want leverage. I want my son back." Have you ever held a single envelope and known it contained enough truth to nuke a marriage and save a child? At the same time, I watched the rhythmic hum of Silas's printer as he drafted the formal demand letter. He addressed it specifically to Lawson, intending to force a legal awakening that would bypass Leonie's filters. The letter reclassified my $85,000 gift as a loan due to fraud and demanded an immediate court-ordered visitation schedule. "If he signs this, the isolation ends," Silas explained. "If he doesn't, we file the lawsuit before the courthouse closes on Monday." "He'll sign," I replied with a steely resolve. "He just needs to see what I've seen." Sandra provided the final bound copy of the audit, complete with the $650 tablet SKU and those damning Kalamazoo hotel receipts. Silas slid the demand letter on top and placed everything into a heavy, plain, brown envelope. The raspy slide of the paper into the sleeve was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in years. The envelope didn't feel like paper. It felt like a slab of reinforced concrete, the only thing capable of stopping the rot. Sandra discovered a final transfer attempt. From that morning, Leonie had tried to take $5,000 more, a desperate smash and grab that proved she knew the net was closing. Silas handed me the envelope with a final warning. "Don't give it to Leonie. Give it to Lawson. He needs to be the one to break the seal." I gripped the metal office door handle, the cold, tactile sensation grounding me. "I've been a bridge inspector for 30 years, I told them. "I know exactly where to put the pressure." I walked to my car with the envelope tucked against my ribs, unaware that Leonie had already sent a text to my phone that changed the terms of the Week 7 visit before I even left the parking lot. The blue light of the text message felt like a cold blade. "Milo isn't feeling well. Don't come Saturday. We'll reschedule in the new year." I sat in my car in the law office parking lot, the notification glowing on my dashboard like a warning flare. The new year. I knew exactly what that meant. By then, Leonie expected me to be safely tucked away in a locked memory care suite in Kalamazoo, my house sold, and my firm liquidated. I realized then that her reschedule was a coded signal to David Price, a final clearing of the board, before she attempted to flee Grand Rapids with the remains of my life on Monday morning. I didn't waste time arguing or pleading. I took a breath and typed a carefully crafted, compliant lie I completely understand. "I already left the house, though, and I have a special surprise for Milo that can't wait. See you in a bit." I picked up my burner phone and made a quick call to Silas. "She's spooked, Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp over the speaker. "If you don't get in that door now, the next time you see Milo will be through a plexiglass window." I put the car in gear, the heavy brown envelope on the passenger seat, feeling like a live round in a chamber. "I'm driving," I told him. Surprises are hard to turn away at the door. I merged onto I-196, the steady hum of the highway beneath my tires providing a rhythmic backdrop to the tactical calculations running through my head. As I passed Millennium Park, the smell of the lake began to drift through the vents on the wind. I could almost hear Eloise's voice beside me, a gentle echo from 40 years of marriage. She always told me that the most important structures aren't made of steel, but of the promises we keep to our children. I looked at the envelope, a weapon made of paper and truth. "I'm finishing this, Elle," I whispered to the empty cabin. "For both our boys. Have you ever driven toward a disaster and felt the strangest sense of peace because you were finally the one carrying the demolition codes?" I reached Holland at exactly 12:55, the manicured streets looking like a stage set for a play that was about to be canceled. I didn't park 2 blocks away. I didn't wait for permission. I pulled directly into the driveway, the nose of my car inches from the bumper of Leonie's black SUV effectively blocking her exit. I adjusted my glasses and gripped the manila envelope, my heart steady for the first time in weeks. I glanced up and saw Milo's face appear briefly at the upstairs window. His eyes wide and curious-looking, perfectly healthy. The lie of his illness was as transparent as the glass he was peering through. I didn't park on the street. I parked on her doorstep, literally and figuratively. I noticed a white moving truck idling just 3 houses down the driver, checking a clipboard. It wasn't a neighbor moving. It was Leonie's advance team for her secret Kalamazoo relocation, ready to gut the house the moment I was disposed of. I stepped out of the car, the heavy envelope in my hand, and saw the front door swing open before I could even reach the porch. Leonie was standing there, but she wasn't alone, and she didn't look happy. I didn't flinch when Leonie slammed the storm door frame, her face twisted into a mask of suburban rage that finally matched the ugliness of the exit strategy I carried in my hand. I stood at the base of the porch steps, the heavy manila envelope tucked under my arm like a girder I was about to drop into place. Leonie stood on the threshold, her expensive perfume clashing with the cold, damp Holland air, flanked by a man in a professional polo shirt. A man in a professional polo shirt, who I later learned was an estate appraiser, stood just behind Leonie with a clipboard and an impatient scowl. It was a tactical error on her part. The man wasn't just here for the furniture. Silas had identified him earlier as a representative for the Golden Years facility. She wasn't just planning my move for the new year. She was preparing to have me removed from my own home this very afternoon. "I told you he was sick, Vance," she hissed, the screech of the storm door punctuating her lie. "Your surprise can wait for the new year. Move your car or I'm calling the police." I looked past her toward the upstairs window, where I could clearly see Milo's healthy face pressed against the glass. "I'm not here for a social visit, Leonie," I said, my voice carrying the same resonance I used when I shut down a bridge site for safety violations. "I'm here for my son." Lawson finally appeared behind her, looking physically diminished and hollowed out, but the sheer level of noise on the porch seemed to pull him toward the light. Silence is a weapon. But sometimes, a single name spoken with enough weight can be a battering ram. "Lawson Kendrick, step outside," I commanded, using the full weight of my authority to cut through his trance. "We are finishing this right now." Leonie began to shriek, her hands clawing at the air, claiming I was confused and dangerous. I ignored her completely. My eyes were locked on my son. "Lawson, walk down these stairs, or the next conversation we have will be in front of a judge on Monday morning." To my immense relief, the decades of respect I'd built with him finally outweighed the 5 years of isolation she'd engineered. He brushed past her, ignoring her attempts to grab his arm, and followed me down to the end of the driveway. We stopped near the black SUV, the glare of the sun reflecting off the polished hood. Have you ever watched the person who used to look up to you for everything finally decide to stop being afraid of a shadow? It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I held out the envelope, the paper raspy against my palms. I should mention that I was also holding my phone live streaming every second of her screaming to Silas Thornton's office, so she couldn't claim I'd raised a hand to her. "Just read it, Lawson," I said, my voice low. "Don't look at her. Look at the numbers." He looked at me, his hands trembling as he reached for the package. "Dad, what have you done?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Lawson's thumb hooked under the flap of the brown envelope, the sound of tearing paper echoing like a gunshot in the quiet suburban air. And I saw Leonie's face drain of color as she realized the seal was finally broken. The first page of the audit didn't just contain numbers. It held the obituary of my son's trust, printed in black and white, and totaling $32,000 of systematic betrayal. I watched Lawson pull the first page of the forensic audit out of the envelope, his eyes scanning the stark black ink of the report as Leonie watched from the porch. The crinkle of cold paper was the only sound in the driveway, save for the low whistle of the lake moisture on the wind. Lawson stood frozen at the edge of the asphalt, his fingers tracing a flowchart that mapped the transfers from the joint account he thought was for Milo's future directly into Leonie's secret, LLC. 32,000, he whispered, and the sound was like a support beam snapping under a heavy load. "Dad, she told me this was for the roof and the electrical upgrades." I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "Check the dates, Lawson. They match her weekend retreats in Kalamazoo." I pointed to a specific line item where she had paid a consultation fee to an attorney 6 months ago to begin the process of declaring me mentally incompetent. His face transformed from defensive skepticism to a hollow, devastating realization. He flipped to the second section, seeing the high-resolution photos I'd taken of the nursing home brochures and the intake December 15th sticky note. He saw the pre-listing agreement for my house, and then with a sharp intake of breath, he saw the one for his own. Have you ever watched the person you loved most turn into a stranger right in front of your eyes simply by turning a page of a bank statement? Lawson physically stumbled against the black SUV, his hand gripping the door handle for support. "Memory care," he stammered, his voice cracking like a dry reed. "She told me you were just visiting friends. She said you were the one who asked to look at options." "I didn't ask for a cage, son," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I asked to see my grandson." The spineless fog that had clouded his vision for years finally cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp anger that I recognized from my own reflection 30 years ago. He looked from the papers to the house where Leonie and the Golden Years representative were watching through the glass. The paper didn't just shake. It screamed. As Lawson stared, his eyes narrowed on Leonie's hands. She was currently handing my son's own passport and Milo's birth certificate to the man in the polo shirt. The exit strategy wasn't just about my money. She was preparing to disappear with my grandson within the hour. The realization was the final structural repair Lawson needed to stand on his own feet again. "Stay here, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a register of righteous fury I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "I'm going inside to get Milo." I gripped his arm, my resolve matching his. "The exit strategy ends here, Lawson. We walk in together." Lawson didn't walk back to the porch. He ran his boots thundering against the driveway like a war drum. I followed, the adrenaline surging through my veins as I watched Leonie's eyes go wide with panic. She reached for the deadbolt to lock us both out, her hand trembling as she realized the seal was finally broken and the truth was in the room. The storm door didn't just rattle. It groaned as Lawson's weight hit the frame, forcing the latch to snap with a metallic crack that signaled the end of Leonie's quiet, laminated reign. I was a half-step behind my son as he breached the perimeter of the home he had been slowly evicted from by degrees. Lawson didn't pause in the foyer. He forced his way into the kitchen, his boots heavy on the hardwood, while Leonie retreated toward the oversized refrigerator. Her clinical mask, usually so seamless, was shattering into jagged lines of pure panic. The estate appraiser stood awkwardly by the granite island, clutching his leather briefcase like a life preserver in a rising tide. "I'm not a child. You can lock out of his own life anymore." Leonie Lawson boomed, and the sheer volume of his voice seemed to rattle the designer light fixtures. Leonie's hand scrambled for her phone. "You're trespassing!" she shrieked, her voice thin and desperate. "I'll call the police." Lawson didn't flinch. He slammed the audit papers onto the granite counter right next to the $600 tablet she'd used as a bribe. I held my phone steady, revealing to her that this live stream was being mirrored directly to the local bank manager who had already frozen her Shell LLC account 10 minutes prior. I turned my gaze to the appraiser. "This man is a witness to a felony, Leonie," I said, my voice calm but vibrating with an old, cold authority. "Do you really want to keep shouting while he's standing here?" I pointed to the brochures on the counter, specifically the intake date for the memory care unit. "This sale is a fraud predicated on elder abuse, and I think the county prosecutor will be very interested in your involvement." The appraiser didn't wait to hear the rest. He snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp rattle and mumbled something about reviewing intake protocols before disappearing through the garage door. Granite is one of the hardest stones on earth, but it cracks surprisingly easy when you slam the truth onto it. The clinical efficiency that had made Leonie formidable for 5 years was evaporating, leaving behind the frantic movements of a cornered animal. She tried to pivot, her eyes darting toward Lawson. "The $32,000 was a secret savings fund," she stammered. "For Milo's private school. It was for his future." Lawson's laugh was a harsh, jagged sound. "Which part of David Price in Kalamazoo is for Milo's education, Leonie?" He reached for her designer purse on the counter before she could grab it. "Have you ever seen a person run out of stories to tell? It's the quietest sound in the world." He dumped the contents out, and a pre-booked one-way flight ticket to Kalamazoo for Monday morning slid across the stone. She was hours away from abandoning him, leaving him with the wreckage of a liquidated life. I watched the cold hum of the refrigerator fill the silence as she slid onto a bar stool, her shoulders finally slumping. "The bridge is down, Leonie," I told her, feeling the heavy finality of the collapse. "There's no more road to run on." She didn't look at Lawson or me. She looked at the tablet on the counter, and I saw a flicker of something much darker than greed in her eyes, a realization that the tablet held a secret we hadn't even found yet. I watched the glow of the tablet screen reflect in Lawson's widening eyes, a digital ghost story unfolding in real time that was about to incinerate the last remains of his marriage. Leonie lunged forward, her clinical mask replaced by a snarl of desperation. But Lawson held the device high out of her reach. His face was a grim mask of determination. The spineless shadow of the man he used to be, finally burned away by the blue light. Because Leonie had set up the tablet using her own primary email, the messaging app was an open window into her double life. Lawson swiped past the games and school apps, finding the deleted folder overflowing with a thread that dated back nearly 2 years. I stood by the kitchen island, watching him read through coordinates for hotel check-ins and intimate photos that were never meant for his eyes. "Lawson, give me that. You're violating my privacy." Leonie shrieked, her long nails scratching at the air. Lawson didn't even look at her. "Privacy," He barked, his voice echoing off the kitchen tiles. You were using my father's life savings to pay for your girl's trips with another man. The discovery was a physical blow. She hadn't just met this man in Kalamazoo, she had been bringing Milo along on her affair trips, using my grandson as a literal alibi for her betrayals. Before I explain what the name David in those messages truly means, if you're still listening, comment A if you'd confront her right now, or B if you'd just walk away and tell me why. Please note, the next part includes recreated details to deepen the emotional impact. If you're not comfortable with dramatized elements, feel free to stop here. Lawson identified David as David Price, the liquidator Silas had flagged. The messages revealed a coordinated plan to wait for the 5-year mark of the marriage to trigger a divorce settlement while stripping me of my assets as a parting gift. Intake December 15th. You were going to lock him away and be in Kalamazoo by Monday morning? Lawson said, his voice dropping into a hollow register of disgust. She wasn't just planning an exit, Lawson, I added. She was planning a demolition. Leonie realized she had lost everything and slumped into a chair in clinical shock. I returned home later, leaving Lawson to handle the immediate wreckage. At 1 a.m, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Lawson's voice was hollow but clear of the gas-lit fog. He had spent hours going through the tablet. The $32,000 was a bounty she'd promised David once she liquidated the old man. 2 years of lies, 1 tablet, 0 excuses left. She never loved me, Dad, Lawson whispered. I was just the infrastructure for her plan. Infrastructure can be rebuilt, son, I told him. The rot is gone now. He found a message from David suggesting they should have me medicated at Lakeview to prevent me from calling a lawyer. Lawson's voice dropped even lower, telling me he had found one more folder, one that contained a video Leonie had taken of me when I thought I was alone, and it was going to be the final nail in her legal coffin. I arrived at the Holland house just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, finding Lawson not in bed, but standing in the driveway with 3 large suitcases and the clinical detachment of a man who had already moved on. The air was sharp with the smell of early morning frost, biting at my lungs as I stepped out of my car. Lawson looked at me, his face a pale mask of exhaustion. Yet his eyes were the clearest I had seen them in years. I followed him into the quiet foyer where Leonie was attempting to maintain her routine, sipping coffee and reviewing a laminated schedule as if the previous day's demolition of her marriage was merely a temporary glitch in the system. Lawson didn't wait for her to speak. He set the evidence-laden tablet on the kitchen island, the blue light of the screen illuminating the jagged truth. He played the final folder video, a recording Leonie had taken of me months ago, when I was sitting in my garden talking softly to the memory of Eloise about my grief. I watched her face as the video played. She had been coached by David Price to frame my private moments of mourning as disorienting episodes of dementia. The cold cruelty of the video silences Leonie's remaining excuses, the footage acting as a mirror to her own predatory nature. Have you ever watched a person pack up 8 years of love into 3 suitcases and realized there was still plenty of room left for the lies? Lawson didn't raise his voice. He simply handed her a pre-printed eviction notice Silas had drafted overnight. The police are on standby, Leonie, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her flinch. You have 1 hour to take what fits in your car. She tried to sneer, her posture still fighting for control. You're making a mistake, she hissed. You can't function without me. I watched in silence as she moved through the house like a scavenger, grabbing high-end designer bags, her jewelry, and the strategic management files while completely ignoring the framed family photos. Lawson stood guard at the top of the stairs, ensuring she didn't touch Milo's birth certificate or the house deed. The house, once a masterpiece of her rigid control, now felt like a crime scene being cleared of its primary suspect. Leave the jewelry my mother gave you, Lawson commanded as she reached for a gold necklace. It wasn't a gift for a stranger. I watched her drag her final suitcase across the hardwood, the screech of a suitcase wheel echoing through the hollow rooms. "Careful with that bag, Leonie," I said as she passed me. "It's heavier than the conscience you've been carrying." She didn't look at me. She dragged her load onto the porch, stepping into the cold morning air. Lawson didn't hesitate. He slid the bolt home, the mechanical whir of the digital lock, serving as the period at the end of an 8-year sentence. He immediately tapped a few commands into his phone, changing the entry codes and sealing the perimeter. The lock clicked. The air in the house suddenly felt breathable for the first time in 4 years. As she reached the curb, she realized her black SUV was gone. I had already had it towed as a corporate asset of the firm. She was left standing there, waiting for an Uber in the frost. Lawson turned to me, his face pale but steady, and asked the one question I had been dreading. "How do we tell Milo his mother isn't coming back for his birthday?" The courthouse steps were cold, but for the first time in 5 years, the wind didn't feel like it was trying to push me away. It felt like it was finally at my back. I walked alongside Lawson as we arrived at the Ottawa County Courthouse in West Olive, the sharp winter air stinging my cheeks, but failing to dampen the steely resolve in my chest. We met Silas Thornton in the long, echoing hallway, the smell of floor wax and old paper wrapping around us like a familiar uniform. Silas had spent the night preparing a comprehensive ex parte motion. He carried the weight of our 7-week undercover protocol in a thick leather briefcase, the forensic audit, the Kalamazoo motel logs, and the chilling brochures for the memory care facility. He explained that our goal today was to secure an emergency protective order to prevent Leonie from moving Milo out of the jurisdiction or finishing the liquidation of my firm. "The paper trail is so thick she won't be able to breathe, let alone argue." Silas set his voice a low hum against the marble walls. "I don't want to fight," Silas Lawson replied, his heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. "I just want my son safe." Silas revealed that Leonie had already attempted to file a countersuit claiming I was menacing the household. But the live stream evidence I had captured on the porch had caused her attorney to withdraw from the case immediately. We were invited into the judge's private chambers to protect Milo's privacy, a quiet room where the scratch of a fountain pen felt like a thunderclap. Silas presented the footage of the Saturday confrontation and the final folder video Leonie had taken of my grief. I watched the judge's expression harden into a mask of professional disgust as the systematic gaslighting and financial exploitation were laid bare. Have you ever stood in a room where a single stroke of a pen restored your right to exist in your own family? I have seen high-conflict divorces, Mr. Thornton, the judge said, looking directly at the audit. But rarely have I seen an engineering firm used as a ransom note. I only ever wanted to be a grandfather. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. The gavel didn't just sound like wood on wood when it finally hit the desk. It sounded like a cage door opening. The judge signed the emergency order granting Lawson immediate primary physical and legal custody of Milo. Leonie was restricted to supervised visitation once a week at a court-approved facility, and a total freeze was ordered on all accounts linked to strategic management. Silas then discovered a hidden $15,000 retainer Leonie had paid to David Price just 3 days ago to expedite the sale of my home. The liquidation had been less than a week away. "It's over," Vance Silas whispered, handing me the embossed document. "The bridge is secure." Lawson gripped my shoulder, his face finally losing the gaunt look of the persecuted. "Let's go home and tell Milo he's going to see his grandpa today," he said. I walked out of that courthouse holding a copy of the order, but my mind was already on the Blandford Nature Center and the promise I had made to Eloise that our grandson would never have to be afraid of his own shadow again. There was no timer in my pocket, No camera in the crown molding, and as Milo grabbed my hand to pull me toward the marsh, the air in Grand Rapids finally tasted like freedom instead of a scheduled appointment. I pulled into the Blandford Nature Center parking lot, the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot, sounding like a celebratory march. Milo was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his face split by a grin that didn't need a laminated schedule to justify its existence. We stepped onto the trail, had the smell of damp pine needles and the cold bite of the winter air on my face, acting as a physical detox from the sterile, rule-bound atmosphere of the Holland house. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't have to check my watch. There was no 2-hour maximum, no safety briefing, and no surveillance. I watched Milo run ahead, his small boots kicking up the late autumn leaves, and I felt a knot in my chest untie itself. "Grandpa, can we go all the way to the water today?" He shouted, his voice echoing through the silent trees. "We can go as far as you want, buddy," I replied, matching his pace. "We have all the time in the world." As we walked, Milo revealed that Leonie had told him the nature center was closed forever, a lie designed to keep his world small enough for her to control. It was a chilling reminder that her isolation tactics weren't just aimed at me, but at the physical reality of a 6-year-old boy. We reached the observation deck overlooking the marsh, and there he was, a great blue heron standing perfectly still in the reeds. "Look how still he is, Milo," I whispered, leaning against the timber railing. "He's a wise old man of the water. He knows that if you wait and watch, you'll see the truth." Milo looked at the bird, then up at me. "Like you did with the envelope, Grandpa, A family is like a marsh. It looks messy on the surface, but underneath there's a complex system of roots holding everything together." I realized then that my grandson had understood more of the struggle than I ever gave him credit for. He pulled out a notebook, the scratch of a crayon filling the silence as he began to draw the statuesque bird. "Grandpa, Grandma, Eloise used to talk about the big blue birds when I was a baby," he said, without looking up. "I'm going to name him Grandma's Bird. I think she's watching us." The spiritual closure hit me with the force of a structural wave. Have you ever looked at a child and realized you didn't just win a court case, you won back the right to tell him who he really is? I felt a profound peace, knowing that the bridge I had built wasn't just for legal access, but to keep my wife's memory alive in the next generation. As I helped Milo back into the car, I found a small, discarded Golden Years business card tucked in the back of his notebook. I realized with a shudder that Leonie had been having him rehearse the visit to the nursing home as a surprise party for me. The betrayal was complete, but it was also over. We drove away in the fading light, the winter sun dipping below the horizon. My phone buzzed with a message from Lawson, a brief note about restructuring the Kendrick firm that reminded me that while the emotional bridge was built, the financial wreckage still needed a structural overhaul. The Holland house didn't smell like lemon bleach and suppressed anxiety anymore. Tonight, it smelled like lumpy spaghetti sauce and the shaky, beautiful beginning of a second chance. I stepped across the threshold and paused my bridge inspector's eye, immediately catching the structural changes that had nothing to do with load-bearing walls. The granite counter, once a sterile landscape for laminated rules, was now buried under a messy, vibrant pile of Milo's drawings. The hum of the kitchen was peaceful, no longer punctuated by the sharp clicking of Leonie's heels or the cold weight of her scrutiny. Lawson stood at the stove, awkwardly stirring a pot, with the concentration of a man trying to rebuild a life from scratch. "I threw the binder in the shredder this morning, Dad," he said, his voice carrying a resonance I hadn't heard in years. I could hear the faint whir of the machine in the office, a mechanical eulogy for the cage he had finally dismantled. I should have done it a long time ago. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension finally beginning to drain from his frame. "Foundations can always be repoured, son," I told him, "as long as the ground is finally level." He told me then that he had already resigned from the school board, burning the final bridge of the life Leonie had architected for him before I even arrived for dinner. It was a preemptive strike, a declaration that he was ready to stand on his own soil. After Milo finished his dinner and ran upstairs to play, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was expectant. Have you ever tasted forgiveness? It's a lot like a home-cooked meal, a little messy, definitely unrefined, but exactly what you need to survive the night. Lawson looked down at his plate, his hands trembling slightly. "I almost let her take everything, Dad. I almost signed you away to that place because I was so afraid of losing my son. She made me believe you were a danger, that your grief was making you unstable." He offered a raw, bleeding apology for the $1,200 demand and the years of spineless compliance. I listened with the patience I usually reserved for watching a concrete pour set, letting him empty the poison from his system. "You were protecting Milo the only way you knew how," I said, "but now we protect him together." The firm was bleeding, but the family was finally clotting. I shifted the conversation toward Kendrick's structural. I revealed that while $32,000 was a steep price for a lesson, Silas had frozen the accounts in time to save our core contracts. "I want you in the office, Lawson," I said, reaching across the table. "Not as a shadow, but as the partner I always hoped for. I want you to learn the administrative side to help me lead the men." I discovered Leonie had actually tried to fire our longest-standing foreman via a forged email right before the hammer fell. It nearly caused a walkout. "I need you there to help me heal those wounds." Lawson reached out his calloused hand, gripping mine in a firm, meaningful shake. "I'd like to learn how to build things that actually hold, Dad." As we cleared the plates, he reached behind the toaster and pulled out a small wrapped box he'd been hiding. It was the box that had been missing from my car for 5 months. I ran my hand over the cardboard of the RC truck box, the same box Leonie had tried to use as a ransom note 5 months ago. And I realized that some gifts aren't just toys, they're declarations of independence. I stood in the Holland kitchen, the air heavy with the smell of cardboard and new plastic, holding the weight of a memory that had nearly been incinerated by greed. Lawson stood beside me, his eyes tired but clear. He confessed that he had hidden the box behind the toaster to save it from the donation bin Leonie had designated for unauthorized clutter. She had even gone so far as to tell Milo the truck was broken and dangerous, a final lie meant to poison the boy's view of my generosity and ensure he never asked for it again. I looked at the bright decals and the rugged off-road tires, seeing them no longer as symbols of my exclusion, but as the first brick in the new foundation we were building. I couldn't let her give it away. Dad, Lawson said, his voice steady. "I knew you'd want to be the one to open it with him." I knotted my throat tight. "You saved more than just a truck, Lawson. You saved a piece of us." On a crisp Saturday morning in late January, I took Milo to a public park in Holland. The cold wind nipped at our ears, but neither of us cared. There was no 2-hour timer ticking in my pocket, and no signature was required for the right to breathe the same air as my grandson. We sat on a weathered park bench, the wood cold beneath us, and tore into the packaging together. I took my time showing him the steering trim and the throttle, explaining the structural durability of the chassis. I wanted him to understand the mechanics, to know that things built with care can withstand a lot of pressure. Have you ever watched a child realize for the first time that love doesn't come with a monthly subscription fee? Milo looked at the remote, his small hands feeling the vibration of the internal servos. "Is it really mine now, Grandpa? No rules?" he asked. I squeezed his shoulder. No rules, buddy. Just physics and fun. He gunned the throttle, and the electric motor let out a high-pitched whine that sliced through the quiet morning. The truck roared to life, its tires finding purchase and sending a spray of frozen grass and dirt into the air. The motor whined. The tires gripped. The past stayed in the rear-view mirror. Lawson watched from the sidelines, leaning against a tree and filming the scene on his phone, not for a legal audit or a clinical report, but for a family archive that was finally ours to keep. I watched the truck navigate the rough, uneven terrain of the park green, bouncing over ruts and hidden dips without slowing down. It occurred to me that my family was much like that machine. We had survived an off-road assault of systematic greed and managed to come out the other side with our chassis intact. Look how fast it goes. Grandpa Milo shouted, his face lit with a pure, unrestricted joy that Leonie had tried so hard to laminate away. It was built to handle the bumps, Milo, I called back. Just like us. Milo steered the truck back toward the parking lot. But as I reached to pick it up, I noticed a familiar car pulling slowly past the park gates, a car that didn't belong to any of our neighbors. I didn't just unlock the front door of Kendrick Structural. I peeled back the closed for inventory sign that Leonie had used to mask her attempts to sell my life's work while I was still breathing. I stood in front of the office in Grand Rapids, the morning sun glinting off the glass. Lawson was beside me, his gaze fixed on the entrance with a mixture of reverence and resolve. The familiar car I'd seen at the park earlier hadn't been a ghost from Leonie's camp, but Silas Thornton's courier, delivering the final legal paperwork that dissolved her remaining strategic management claims to the firm's equipment. We were truly clear. I pushed open the door, the air inside stale and heavy, with the smell of old ink and blueprints. Several desks had been cleared, remnants of the efficiency cuts she had started making the moment she thought I was a failing machine. I led Lawson to the primary drafting table, the cold surface feeling like a solid anchor. This is where the blueprints for the city's major bridges were first born, I told him. She almost sold the desks out from under us, Lawson. But she couldn't sell the expertise. I watched as he ran his hand over the wood, his eyes finally showing the spark of purpose that Leonie had spent years trying to extinguish. "I'm ready to learn, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet strength. "Show me where the load-bearing beams are." I began the actual training, then showing him the administrative archives and our structural inspection protocols. A business is like a bridge. It's only as strong as the connections between the people who cross it. I pulled out a hidden project I'd been working on during my forced isolation, a plan for a new pedestrian bridge at the Blandford Nature Center. It was a literal bridge to celebrate Milo's future. Lawson looked at the drawings, his finger tracing the lines of the trusses. "A bridge for the herons Milo would love," that he whispered. "It's a bridge for us, son," I replied. A way to show the city we're still standing. As the sun began to dip, casting an amber glow through the office windows, I felt a vibration of professional pride I thought I'd lost forever. The key felt cold. The promise felt warm. I pulled my heavy brass key ring from my pocket and slid the office key off, placing it in Lawson's hand. I explained that I wasn't retiring to a memory care facility, but into a role as a senior consultant. I was leaving the day-to-day integrity of the firm to him. "I was a bridge inspector for 30 years, I told him. "My last and best inspection tells me you're ready." Lawson gripped the key, his nod a silent vow of loyalty. "I won't let the foundation crack again, Dad," he said. As we prepared to leave, Lawson reached under the main drafting table and pulled off a metallic object. It was a hidden bug Leonie had taped there to record firm secrets for David Price. The metallic click of it being pulled off was the final sound of her reign. As we walked out, I saw the two photographs on my desk, Eloise with Milo and Lawson with the office keys, and I realized the legacy wasn't just safe, it was finally whole. The moonlight caught the silver frames on my desk, illuminating two versions of the same victory, the woman who taught me how to love a legacy, and the man who finally learned how to protect it. I sat in the quiet of my Grand Rapids home office, the silence no longer a heavy burden, but a serene blanket. I looked at the two photographs that now served as the windowsill sentinels of my life. The first was an old, grainier Polaroid of Eloise holding a newborn Milo, her eyes shining with a fierce, protective heat that I had only recently come to fully understand. The second was a fresh print of Lawson, standing with a straight back in front of the firm's drafting table, brass keys gripped in his hand. The spineless fog had vanished from his expression, replaced by the sharp, focused gaze of a man who knew his own worth. "We did it, Elle," I whispered to the empty room. The bridge held. I thought about the structural integrity of a family that had been tested by a 4-year siege and refused to collapse. The next morning, I drove to the Holland House for an unscheduled Sunday breakfast, a simple freedom that still felt like a miracle every time I turned onto their street. I let myself in and headed straight for the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee brewing greeted me like an old friend. I stopped in front of the refrigerator. Under Leonie's rule, it had been a sterile expanse of stainless steel, a cold monument to her control. Now it was a vibrant, chaotic gallery. Milo's drawings were everywhere held up by mismatched magnets that weren't arranged in a grid. A refrigerator door is the heartbeat of a home. It tells you exactly who is loved and what is valued. I noticed Lawson had replaced the old laminated safety guidelines on the side of the fridge with a messy handwritten list titled Milo's Weekend Adventures. "Coffee's on Dad," Lawson called out from the living room, his voice easy and warm. "No schedule today." I didn't answer right away because I was staring at a specific piece of structural art. Milo had drawn a bridge over a marsh with a large blue bird watching from the reeds. It was the great blue heron from the Nature Center rendered in waxy blue crayon. Have you ever looked at a piece of crayon art and realized it was a more important document than any court order? I looked closer at the 3 figures Milo had drawn standing on the bridge me, Lawson and a smaller version of himself. But it was the reflection in the crayon blue water that made my breath hitch. Beneath our feet in the mirrored world of the marsh, he had drawn a 4th figure wearing a wide sun hat. It was Eloise. The isolation Leonie had attempted had failed on a spiritual level. My wife was still the foundation of this family. I reached out to touch the corner of the paper, and my fingers brushed against something hidden. I flipped the drawing over and found a small note written in a child's careful script, "Happy birthday, Grandpa." It was dated from months ago, back when the rule binders were still on the counters. Milo had hidden it from Leonie for half a year, proving the child had been my secret ally through the entire storm. I turned away from the fridge, the waxy paper tucked into my pocket, and realized that while the battle for the firm was over, my true work as a grandfather was only in its first beautiful chapter. If you're sitting there right now, comfortable in your chair, and you can't remember the last time you saw your grandson without a witness or a stopwatch, do you really believe you're in control? Or are you just following a structural diagram designed for your own demolition? I am an engineer by trade. I spent my life looking for micro cracks in steel and rot in timber, but I almost missed the collapse of my own family because the predator didn't carry a sledgehammer. She carried a laminate binder. Isolation is a load-bearing wall they remove while you're sleeping. By the time you notice the ceiling sagging, they've already sold the foundation. In the structural anatomy of abuse, the first sign isn't a locked door. It's a series of safety rules. It's being told you have to park 3 blocks away to spare the neighbors. It's being told that for the child's online security, your phone needs to be audited. These aren't just inconveniences. They are the preliminary cuts intended to sever your social ties before the final liquidation begins. You need to identify the Leonies of the world before they move in. They often use the strategic management excuse, the professionalization of your private relationships, to hide the fact that they are siphoning your legacy. The most dangerous predators don't look like criminals. They look like helpful, organized caregivers who claim to be protecting you from your own aging mind. Silas Thornton recently told me he is investigating 3 other families right here in Grand Rapids who were targeted by David Price. This liquidator wasn't just working with Leonie. He was part of a larger network of elder exploitation that preys on the quietest corners of our lives. Look at your checkbook right now. Are those your signatures, or are they just echoes of someone else's greed? If they're tracking your steps, it's because they're measuring you for a cage. I sat in my home office, the ticking of the clock in the background, the only sound in the nighttime silence. I knew I had to offer a final blueprint for survival. Don't wait for the new year to check your bank statements. You need to build your own war room before the first crack appears. Find your own Silas for legal protection and a Sandra for financial forensics. Audit your trust before someone else does it for you. Inspect your own life with the same scrutiny you'd give a bridge carrying your children's cars. Trust is a bridge. But even the best bridges need a periodic inspection. My story had a successful reconstruction, but I know many bridges collapse in total silence. I took the recovered $32,000 and used it to fund a local nonprofit that provides free forensic audits for seniors. I want my survival story to be a structural template, a way to ensure the next grandfather doesn't have to fight for the right to breathe the same air as his grandson. I reached out and closed the bridge journal one last time, the weight of the book feeling final and right. But as I stood up, I saw a familiar manila envelope sitting on the edge of the desk. It wasn't a demand this time, and it didn't contain a list of rules. It was a scratchy, hand-delivered thank you note from the son I almost lost to a structural failure of the heart. And as I touched the paper, I realized that while the engineering was done, the living had finally begun. I held the cream-colored card in my hands, feeling the weight of the words Lawson had written, not a structural report on a bridge, but a reconstruction of a son's respect that I thought had been demolished forever. The tactile feel of the heavy cardstock grounded me as I stood in my quiet office, the smell of old books and fresh hope filling the space. Lawson's note revealed that he had actually found my bridge journal 3 weeks ago while I was visiting Milo. He hadn't said a word because he wanted me to see the plan through on my own terms, but he'd spent those weeks watching me with a new understanding. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself," he wrote. I traced the ink with my thumb, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "You were always worth the inspection, son," I whispered to the empty room. This was the true load-bearing wall of my life, the one I thought Leonie had managed to compromise. It wasn't just about civil engineering. It was about the survival of the Kendrick name. I looked at my bridge inspection tools one last time. The calipers, the levels, the high-intensity flashlight, before stowing them away in their velvet-lined cases. Truth is the only material that doesn't fatigue under pressure. In engineering, we call it a catastrophic failure when a structure gives way. In life, we just call it a lie coming home to roost. Leonie's failure was a failure of physics. She tried to build an entire existence on a foundation of shifting sands and calculated deceptions. Under the sheer pressure of the truth, we uncovered her structure was destined to collapse. A man's word is the rebar in the concrete of his life. Without it, the whole thing is just dust waiting for a storm. I looked out the window toward the park, where I knew Lawson and Milo were currently racing that RC truck. I could almost hear the distant, happy shout of my grandson echoing through the Grand Rapids night. I turned back to my desk, my gaze landing on a third photo that had arrived that morning, a professional rendering of the Eloise Kendrick Memorial Bridge. The city had officially approved the project at the Nature Center. It was a bridge for her, for Milo, and for every family that needs a path back to each other. The light went out. The story was done. The bridge was safe. I looked directly into the darkness, addressing you one last time. Your legacy is your own to protect. Don't let anyone convince you that your voice is a burden, or that your mind is failing simply because you remember how things ought to be. Build your bridges well, and never stop checking the supports. I reached for the brass desk lamp, the click of the switch echoing in the profound silence. Silver moonlight cut through the dark, illuminating the photos on the windowsill, the faces of the people I fought for. I stood there for a moment, watching the city lights reflect in the glass, a senior consultant of my own destiny. The house was silent, but it wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the quiet, steady hum of a foundation that had finally been set right. Good night, and stay vigilant. I wasn't expecting the bank's notification to feel like a victory parade, but when the screen flashed with the restoration of $32,000, it felt like the final support beam of my life had just been bolted back into place. I sat in my home office, the morning light filtering through the blinds, as the phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. It was Silas Thornton. The criminal referral for financial elder abuse had finally forced Leonie's hand. To avoid a prison sentence that would have surely followed a trial, she had signed over her remaining share of the strategic management liquid assets and a significant portion of her personal savings. She chose her freedom over the money. Vance Silas said, his voice crackling with professional satisfaction. The restitution is being wired as we speak. I closed my eyes, leaning back in my chair. It was never about the cash, Silas, I replied. It was about the principle of the structure. Silas then shared a detail that made me chuckle for the first time in months. The Golden Years facility had actually sued Leonie for breach of contract and misrepresentation, using the evidence I'd gathered to claw back the initial deposit she had made with my stolen funds. Even the institutions she tried to use as weapons had turned against her. David Price was officially de-licensed as a liquidator in the state of Michigan. The Vulture was finally grounded. I drove downtown to meet with Sandra Obi one last time, the smell of fresh rain on the pavement, providing a clean, sharp scent to the city. We sat in her quiet office, and I watched the cold, tactile click of her mouse button during the final audit. I watched the screen as the joint account balance updated. The zeros vanished, replaced by the $32,000 Leonie had siphoned away. Numbers don't lie. People do. But when the numbers finally line up, the lies have nowhere left to hide. Sandra leaned back, her task complete. Every penny is back where it belongs, she said. I'm archiving the exit strategy files for good. I nodded, watching the digital ledger. Put them in a safe place, Sandra. They are a reminder of what happens when we stop paying attention. I realized then that the final audit had uncovered one more betrayal. Leonie had actually intended to use $5,000 of that money to buy a silence agreement from a local bank clerk. The clerk had turned her down, starting the very paper trail Silas had followed to save me. I stepped out of the building, the warmth of the spring sun hitting my face. Restitution is the final bolt in the truss. It doesn't make the bridge pretty, but it makes it safe to walk on. I pulled out my phone and sent a simple text to Lawson, account restored. The foundation is solid. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching a group of workers repairing a section of concrete nearby. Restitution is more than a check, I thought. It is the world admitting you were right. I walked back to my car, but as I looked at my reflection in the bank's glass doors, I didn't see a victim of an exit strategy anymore. I saw the man who had designed a better one. The reconstruction was complete, and the Kendrick name was finally standing on level ground. I didn't check my watch when I pulled into the driveway, and for the first time in years, the front door wasn't a barrier, it was an invitation. The April air in Holland was crisp, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new beginnings. I walked into the house and immediately noticed the absence of the mechanical hum that had haunted the foyer. The surveillance camera in the crown molding had been ripped out, leaving a small, honest scar in the plaster. Lawson was in the kitchen, and for the first time since Eloise passed, he looked like a man who owned the ground he stood on. Milo was perched on a stool, his face smeared with flour. "Grandpa, do you want the pancake with the extra chocolate chips?" he chirped, holding a wobbly plastic spatula like a trophy. I took a seat at the island, the granite counter finally clear of Leonie's clinical safety protocols. "There's no timer on breakfast today," Dad Lawson said, sliding a mug of coffee toward me. "Stay as long as you want." As he spoke, a hidden secondary phone fell out of a false bottom in a desk drawer the movers were currently clearing from the office. It skittered across the floor, containing unencrypted messages to David Price about a fallback plan my quick legal action had completely neutralized. It was a final pathetic rattle of a dying structure. Have you ever watched a parasite leave its host and realized the host was actually stronger than it was before the infection started? I felt that strength vibrating in the kitchen as we listened to the metallic rumble of a moving van ramp outside. A stoic woman from the county office stood by the driveway, her clipboard a shield against any final dramatics Leonie might have planned. We stood on the porch, watching hired hands carry out the final symbols of her strategic management lifestyle designer furniture and empty filing cabinets. Leonie appeared one last time, her clinical composure replaced by a bitter, hollowed-out silence. She attempted to grab a specific porcelain heirloom vase from a box, but Lawson stepped forward, his hand steady. He produced a photo from the Audit, proving it was a gift I gave to Eloise 40 years ago. She dropped her hand, the cold, tactile feel of the porcelain remaining with us as she turned away. "You think you've won, but you're just living in a ruin," she hissed, her voice thin as a dying wire. I looked her in the eye, feeling nothing but a somber finality. "A ruin can be rebuilt, Leonie," I told her. "A hollow structure just falls." She climbed into an Uber, leaving the empty space in the driveway where her SUV used to sit like a permanent threat. The van turned the corner. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Lawson leaned against the door frame, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. "Is she really gone, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She's gone, son," I replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The structural integrity is restored." I heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding into a new secure position behind us. I looked down at the porch, where the heirloom vase sat catching the morning light, and realized that while the house was finally empty of her, the true reconstruction was only just beginning in the room where Milo was waiting. The shredder didn't just eat the plastic-coated pages of Leonie's grandparenting guidelines. It hummed with the sound of a family finally reclaiming the right to exist without a permission slip. I stood in the Holland kitchen with Lawson, the morning light pouring over a counter that was no longer a clinical workstation. We gathered every laminated document she had left behind, the rigid schedules, the lists of prohibited foods, and the maps of where I was allowed to park. As I fed the first sheet into the machine, the raspy whir of the paper shredder was the most melodic thing I'd heard in years. Watching the controlling structures turn into harmless plastic confetti felt like watching the demolition of a prison. Lawson found a draft of a confession Leonie had written, but never sent, admitting she chose David Price because he promised her a clean break from the Kendrick name. It was the last ghost in the machine. "I think I'm going to enjoy the silence of a house without a manual," Lawson said, his voice steady as he poured 2 glasses of bourbon. "Manuals are for machines, son," I replied, clinking my glass against his. "Families are built on trust, not plastic." We stood there for a long time, watching the bin fill with the remains of her reign. Later that afternoon, I took Milo back to the Blandford Nature Center. The smell of swamp water and fresh pine was sharp and clean. I carried a professional-grade set of binoculars, the cold, tactile focus ring smooth under my fingers. Have you ever noticed how the smallest lens adjustment can turn a blurry shadow into a clear, sharp truth? I taught Milo how to calibrate the focus, explaining that in both engineering and life, you have to adjust your lens to see the things that are trying to hide. "If you look close enough, you can see the heron's heartbeat," I told him. "That's called attention to detail." Milo gripped the binoculars with his small, warm hands. "I see him, Grandpa. He's standing on one leg just like Grandma's bird." I felt the structural stability of our new bond finally setting like reinforced concrete. Milo then revealed his own secret. He had kept a log of drawings hidden in his pillowcase, showing every time Leonie had made his father cry. It was a heartbreaking confirmation that the boy had been his father's silent protector all along. I watched Milo through the tall grass, reflecting on the exit strategy that failed so spectacularly. I almost lost my mind to gaslighting and my legacy to fraud. But I gained a partnership with my son that is stronger than any bridge I ever inspected. The heron took flight. The sky was wide. The cage was gone. I looked at the marsh one last time and delivered a final silent promise to Eloise. "The foundation is solid, Elle," I thought. "I'm taking our boy home now." The winter of our isolation was over, and the spring was finally here to stay. I watched the bird disappear into the Grand Rapids skyline and realized that my life's greatest inspection wasn't over a river. It was over the dinner table, and for the first time in years, the report came back perfect. I realized as I stepped into my office that the most enduring structures aren't made of steel or stone, but of the stories we refuse to let the world erase. The evening was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of a house at peace, and the distant, muffled laughter of Milo playing in the backyard. I walked over to the heavy iron safe in the corner of my study, the crisp sound of the safe door clicking shut after I dialed the combination echoing against the mahogany bookshelves. I pulled a worn, leather-bound book from the darkness, Eloise's personal journal. Leonie had claimed it was lost in the move years ago, a calculated lie intended to sever my connection to the woman who built my foundation. I spent the afternoon immersed in her handwriting, the smell of old leather and vanilla paper rising from the pages like a physical presence. I found a tucked-away letter she had addressed specifically to a future Vance. It was as if she had looked through time and seen the cracks forming. She urged me to trust the math of the heart and predicted that our family would eventually face a test of its very core. "Our son has your eyes and my stubborn heart. May he always build things that last," she had written. I traced the ink with a trembling finger, whispered an apology for how long it took me to find her voice again, and felt the final emotional anchor drop into place. A journal is just ink on paper until it's read by the eyes of the person who lived it. Then it's a structural beam for the soul. Lawson arrived later that evening, not as a weary visitor under surveillance, but as my partner. He carried the heavy tactile feel of a high-end blueprint under his arm, the finalized plans for the Kendrick structural office renovation. We sat together under the warm sunset light, looking at the layout that included a dedicated space for Milo to learn the trade. I want Milo to grow up knowing the difference between a building and a home. Lawson said, his voice ringing with a purpose that had been suppressed for too long. I nodded, clinking my glass against his. Then we'd better make sure the blueprints are perfect, partner. He then revealed he'd established a scholarship in Eloise's name for young engineers who focus on structural ethics. It was the perfect tribute. I stood up and cleared a space on my main shelf, placing Eloise's journal alongside my original bridge inspection logs and the final court order. It was a history of love work and justice all bound together. The book closed. The story lived on. I realized that while I was officially retired, my role as the guardian of this legacy was a lifetime appointment I finally accepted with a peaceful heart. The inspection is over. The results are in. We're still standing. I reached for the brass desk lamp, the click of the switch signaling the end of the long day. I turned off the office light and saw the golden glow of the sunset hitting the gold leaf lettering on the spine of Eloise's journal. And I knew that no matter how many exit strategies were designed, some foundations are simply too deep to be moved. My work was done, the bridge was secure, and for the first time in 5 long years, the structural report for the Kendrick family was perfect. Most people see a bridge as a way to get from one side to the other. But as I stood on the timber planks of the marsh overlooking, I saw it for what it truly was, a promise that no member of this family would ever be stranded on an island again. I stood on the newly completed Eloise Kendrick Memorial Bridge, the warm summer breeze carrying the scent of marsh grass and the thick heat of a West Michigan afternoon. I ran my hand over the cold, solid feel of the brass memorial plaque. It was modest, just like Eloise, but engineered with a precision that would outlast us all. The irony wasn't lost on me as I looked down at the supports. This entire project had been funded by the liquidated assets Silas clawed back from Leonie's secret shell company. Her greed had become the literal foundation of our new memorial, a final structural correction that turned an exit strategy into an entry point for the community. Lawson stood beside me, his sneakers silent on the timber as he looked out over the water. She would have loved the view from here, Dad. He said, his voice carrying a serene triumph that had replaced the years of hollowed-out exhaustion. I nodded, watching the golden light of the late afternoon play across the reeds. She's the reason the view exists, Lawson. I watched my son reach down to adjust Milo's backpack, a simple, unscripted gesture of affection that had been impossible under the clinical surveillance of the past 4 years. By fighting Leonie's cold, calculated control, I realized I hadn't just saved my own life. I had given Lawson the tools to be a father who leads with his heart rather than a manual. The cycle of isolation was broken. The structural integrity of the Kendrick men was finally a self-sustaining system bonded by a history we refused to let the world erase. A bridge is just a handshake between 2 shores. If the handshake is honest, the bridge will never fall. I'm taking Milo to the engineering firm tomorrow. Lawson told me, a spark of professional pride in his eyes. He wants to see the big blueprints. I smiled, thinking of the drafting table back at the office. Make sure he knows he's the most important part of the design, I replied. The case is closed. The bridge is open. The Kendricks are home. A final letter from Leonie's lawyer arrived this morning, confirming she has moved to another state and waived all future claims to the firm. The last tether was cut. I addressed the silence of the marsh one last time, a final message for anyone who might be listening. Isolation thrives in the dark, but it cannot survive the light of a forensic audit and the weight of a shared truth. Check your foundations, protect your legacy, and never ever let them tell you you're alone. Milo's laughter broke my reflection as he started to jog toward the trailhead. "Race you to the car, Grandpa," he shouted, his sneakers thumping rhythmically against the wood. I turned my back to the marsh, walking away from the overlook, flanked by the two men who carried my name. Behind us, the beating wings of a great blue heron taking flight echoed through the trees, a final release of the past into the soaring potential of the future. I watched my son and grandson disappear into the green of the woods, and I knew that while I was the one who inspected the bridges, they were the ones who would finally learn to cross them without fear. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this family story was never just about money or legal papers. It was about the quiet ways trust can erode when you stop paying attention. For years, I believed love alone could hold a family together. But this family story taught me that even the strongest bonds need honesty, vigilance, and courage to protect them. If you are listening to my family story, learn from my mistake. Do not ignore the small warning signs simply because the person causing them shares your last name. Some people might call what I did dad revenge, but the truth is more complicated. My dad revenge was never about hatred or punishment. It was about protecting my grandson, my son, and the legacy my wife helped build. Still, every dad revenge carries a cost, because when family breaks, a part of your heart breaks with it. If there is one lesson I can leave behind, it is this: never surrender your voice just to keep the peace. Protect your dignity, your independence, and your relationships before someone else decides their value for you. I also believe that somewhere along this difficult road, God was guiding us back to the truth, reminding me that faith and patience can rebuild even a shattered home. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey. I would truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Vance's position, facing that kind of betrayal and impossible choice? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories like this. A gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from complex family situations and real social issues, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't what you're looking for, please feel free to explore other videos that might suit you better.